Storytime with Stephanie Storey.
I am art historical novelist Stephanie Storey, and this is my show, Storytime. Today, I'm very much looking forward to this conversation because it is we're going to talk mainly about a part of American history that I thought I knew something about, and apparently I was wrong. So I'm learning so much by doing this interview, which you know is one of my favorite things to do. My guest today was a professor of history, written 3 books about American women in the Philippines, Angels of the Underground, Prisoners in Paradise, and Citizen of Empire. But her newest book is called Dr. Mary Walker's Civil War, One Woman's Journey to the Medal of Honor and the Fight for Women's Rights. This is so exciting. Okay, welcome to the show, Theresa Kaminski.
Thank you so much, Stephanie.
I am excited about having you here because I feel like a fool that I did not know who Mary Walker was. So can you please tell my audience at home, who was Mary Walker?
The subtitle gives away so much of the book that looking at the cover really gives you just that encapsulation, but you're right, there's so much more to that. The fact that she was awarded the Medal of Honor in 1865, she's the only woman who has ever received that particular distinction. And that always is a subject of discussion, I think, probably for a lot of people who follow military history, especially if they follow Civil War history, the fact that there was this one lone woman who was able to receive this award really does come as a big surprise. And especially when you fold that into the other part of that subtitle, the fight for women's rights, you also don't expect that award coming to a woman who was so unconventional. I mean, you would expect that a female doctor in the 19th century is going to be a little bit unusual, and that's true. It was unusual to find women as doctors, especially with medical degrees, especially if they were not treating female patients. So that was another big distinction. So the fact that she was and during her lifetime, the word notorious was often used because she was such a radical and so uncompromising. So the fact that she was recognized by the United States Army, by the federal government with this award was really an unusual and very special thing.
Okay, so she was a doctor for the Union Army during the Civil War, right? And she treated how many soldiers? Do we know like how many people she might have treated? Or
no, I don't think we can even put numbers on it because just the nature of the kind of medicine she was practicing, a lot of it was done very quickly. In some cases, high turnover of patients, and especially beginning in about 1862, she was on the move quite a bit. She traveled along with the Army. She had spent most of 1861 after she came to Washington, D.C. She remained in Washington and maybe in the immediate vicinity in nearby Virginia, treating soldiers. And she was, at the beginning of this, she was volunteering her services. She went to Washington probably in the late summer or early fall of 1861, and she headed right to the office of the United States Secretary of War. And she said, I want a commission. She wanted to be brought into the United States Army as a commissioned officer, which is how other male medical personnel were brought in. She figured because she had a medical degree, because she had already practiced medicine for a few years, she was as qualified as anybody else. So she figured she deserved the same kind of job and treatment. And she was, of course, denied this commission. And rather than just pack up and go back home to New York, she started going around to all of the hospitals in Washington, D.C. to see if somebody would take her on. And she finally found a very sympathetic doctor at what was called the Indiana Hospital that had been set up in the old patent office building. And it was a man, I wasn't able to find out a whole lot about him, but his name was Dr. Green, and he was simply overwhelmed. He had lost his previous assistant surgeon, and medical personnel were in such short supply that when Mary Walker showed up, he was thrilled. He was happy to have her there. He offered to pay her from his own salary, which she declined. She said he probably needed it more than she did. I think he had a family. And so she was volunteering her services, and she continued to do that even during 1862 when she finally leaves Washington and she goes out. And this is when she ultimately ends up in Tennessee, and she's kind of traveling along or behind the army, going to places. She's not in active battle situations, but she usually arrived at places within a day or two after the fighting stopped. So she was there to treat anybody who had wounds, who was sick. And she did this until 1864, when she was finally not commissioned into the military, but she was hired on. She was actually employed by the United States Army as what was known as a contract surgeon. So she was still a civilian, but she pretty much had the authority of the Army, and she was primarily supposed to be treating soldiers.
What compelled her to do? I mean, this is like extraordinary. You don't have a job from the government, military's not hiring you, you're doing a volunteer, you can't. What compelled her emotionally to go follow the Army and help take care of soldiers? Did you find that? I mean, it's an impossible answer, right? But
right. I mean, I and you probably come across this in your own research for your own writing. You're always looking for that one thing that says, aha, this is how and why. And I think she comes very close to this because she is writing during the war. She writes for a small women's rights newspaper that is actually dedicated to the thing that she thought was the most important thing for women gaining equality with men. And for Mary Walker, that was the right to wear whatever kind of clothing people chose. And she was very clear on this. And I think most people have probably heard of the bloomer costume. You know, we envision that sort of mid-19th century, the big blousey trousers with a long skirt over it. And this was supposed to be the symbol of women's emancipation in the mid-1800s. And many women's rights activists who adopted the bloomer costume very quickly gave it up. They found that they were subjected to so much ridicule when they went out in public wearing this outfit that they thought it had a negative effect on the other causes of the movement. Before the Civil War, a lot of women's rights activists were focused very heavily on getting legal protections for married women's property rights, because normally when a woman got married, everything she owned then passed to her husband. So there had been quite a bit of progress on that front, and a lot of women were worried that all this attention on what a woman wore was going to have a negative impact on everything else. So they stopped doing it. Mary Walker never stopped. And she never gave up her belief that this was the core problem with gender equality, that for women, as long as they were physically hampered by these long, cumbersome skirts, and I mean, we all know about those hoops, those big contraptions that went underneath. And Walker thought, well, how can women physically keep up with men if they are compelled to dress this way? So she refused. After the 1850s, she never went back to wearing a dress. So for her, it comes down to equal rights, and anything that a man can do, a woman should be able to do. And gender just should not get in the way of those determinations.
have you ever tried to put her in today's era and think, what would have Mary Walker thought about the Me Too movement, or where we are, or how far we've come, or how far we haven't come?
Oh, definitely. I do think about that a lot, especially when I read stories about what women are doing in the military today, because this was another thing for Mary Walker. She never wanted to be the only woman ever commissioned by the military. She wanted any woman who was willing to serve her country. She thought any woman should be allowed to sign up. So I think every time I read a story about, oh, women can now do this in the Army or the Marines, and I think, yeah, Mary Walker would have been so pleased about that. And I think that when the next woman wins the Medal of Honor, I mean, she would be very happy about that too. I don't think for her, the value of that award was that she was the only woman to ever get it. I think for her, the value was she was a woman and she got this award. So she thought that it should be for other women as well. And so, yeah, I do think, every day when we put on pants or leggings or shorts, I think for Mary Walker, this was exactly the point. We don't, well, maybe some people do. They choose their outfits thinking, what do I want to express today about who I am? For a lot of the rest of us, we just think, how are we going to get through the day and look, okay. And so, but basically the point is, she thought each person should be able to make that decision themselves. And no matter if they were men or women, they got to choose. And she did say something once about she didn't wear men's clothing because she wore her own clothing. So I think her point was, if she put it on, you couldn't legitimately refer to it as men's clothing, because she, and this is fairly clear from the sources, she did consider herself a woman. I mean, today we talk about gender in a very different way than they did in the 19th century, but she was very clear that she was a woman. And she never, even toward the end of her life, when she was wearing very tailored clothing, and she got to the point where when she went out for a formal occasion, she had a top hat and a cane, and still she would not entertain any notions that this was masculine attire. It was what she chose to wear.
But you said something I have to go back and pick up when I was looking all stunned, I think. Is she still the only woman to have won the Medal of Honor?
Yes.
What?
Yes. And this is, I haven't done as much reading on the Medal of Honor as I should. So I know just the basics about it, and the way that the criteria has been established for the 20th century especially. It does require bravery in the face of the enemy, and normally this means under fire. So when you get through 2 world wars, and American women did serve in the military in both world wars, but they were supposed to be kept out of direct combat situations. And we know through the 20th century that's changed over time. So women haven't had the same opportunities that men have had to even qualify for the award. But you're right in your shock that you would think certainly by now.
I honestly thought she was the first, and that's great, and I wanted to hear about her. It didn't sink in when she was the only.
That's cool. I've heard, and I sorry, I don't know the woman's name, but I have heard that there is somebody else today who is supposed to be under serious consideration, and I'm not clear if it's for service in Afghanistan, but it may be that this is going to turn into Mary Walker being the first of, 1 or 2 or more, which I think she would be very happy about. And certainly she would be very happy to see women voting, because that was, and really that took up the bulk of her public career after the war, was women's rights issues, especially suffrage. So voting, holding public office, she made some attempts herself to run for office. So she would have, I think, been pretty comfortable in the 21st century.
I have to change gears a little bit because I do also want to ask you, we're in the middle in this country of a, I hate to say it's not new. It's a very old problem that I feel like is getting more attention, or maybe more seriousness of attention, or maybe there's just more energy behind it, and we will end up having actual change come forward, which is all of our racial inequality protests that came up particularly around George Floyd's death, that seem to get a new sort of focused energy. And it has led to, there's this discussion over taking down Confederate monuments and renewed discussion in that. And there seems to be more of that. And Mississippi just changed their flag to take down the Confederate flag. I'm asking about this because you wrote about a very prominent woman in the Civil War. Did getting into that research give you any perspective on this moment, on the Confederate monuments moment, or how we are looking back at sort of the way the history of the Civil War has paid off, or is still happening, is still affecting us today? It's a huge question, and we're not going to answer it in 2 seconds, and I don't expect anybody to.
Taking down those monuments is a good thing. And again, the connection with Mary Walker is she had spent about 4 months as a prisoner of war. She was taken captive by Confederate soldiers in 1864. And so she spent time as a prisoner of war. So she knew a lot of the real downsides of warfare. It was not glorious to her. And yet when she was released from that prison, her first thought was to get back to work. And in the last months of the war, she was in Kentucky, and she had been assigned to work at a women's prison, essentially a detention facility for women in the area who had been Confederate sympathizers. And Mary Walker did not get along with those women, because she did not see any sense of sisterhood cutting across these sectional lines. She believed Southerners who supported the Confederacy were wrong, and they were clearly, to her, the enemies of the United States. And I think she would have been really, and I didn't really see evidence of this in her lifetime, because certainly she was still alive when some of these monuments started going up. But I think that she would have disapproved, and she probably did disapprove, that, oh, and I do have an example, sorry. In 1867, so not long after the war, she made, I think, her only overseas trip. She went to England to tour hospitals, and for a brief time she was in Paris. And she was in Paris during one of those big centennial fairs, you know, like a World's Fair. And she was very upset when she went into one of the US exhibits, and it had a photograph, I think, of Robert E. Lee. And she was outraged because she thought it looked too celebratory, maybe, that he was being glorified as this, you know, brilliant general. And she tore down the picture, and she was yelling at the person in charge of this exhibit, saying, you know, this man, he went to war against the United States. How could you have his picture up here? So I think she clearly would have been on the side of take down the monuments. And if I could give a plug to some other historians who I really, when I read stuff online, and for anybody who's watching this, I would certainly direct you to any of Karen Cox's writing, especially her book called Dixie's Daughters, where she traces how these monuments got set up in the first place and why. It's a really, really marvelous book. Another historian named Anne Marshall wrote a book called Creating a Confederate Kentucky, where she looks at how the Civil War became remembered by people in Kentucky. So those are good places to start if you want to learn more about this. And on a daily basis, I follow current politics through another historian named Heather Richardson, who has a huge social media following. And every day she provides, with citations, she cites her sources, the news of the day. I mean, and it's a great, it's just about a page long of reading, but it's so marvelously clear and concise that I look at that to see. I mean, that's my news fix for the day.
It's so interesting because one, every story you tell me about Mary Walker just makes me more in awe of her, and now I have to read your book and read all about her, because I'm sort of amazed by her consistent courage and just that like fierceness, I guess that's what we would call it today. And two, you were listing off all of these historical sites. I'm thinking about not only with the Black Lives Matter movement right now in its place, but with the pandemic, we are living through this historical moment in the world and in the country. And as a historian, have you been able to process yet how this moment is going to change what you write about or how you view history in any way? Is it going to alter that? It already has, sort of, for me. I keep asking people how, history lovers particularly, how living through this big historical moment is going to change your perspective.
Yeah, and as I was talking about that, I was just thinking of the one big faux pas I always make. There are so many Black women historians that I should also be talking about. And, I think about Erica Dunbar, who wrote this marvelous book about Ona Judge, who was enslaved by Martha and George Washington. So there are all sorts of great books too by Black historians that really get at the times back then and today. And one more recommendation while I'm thinking of it. Annette Gordon-Reed, who has written about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. I every time she writes something, I have to read it. There are all of these marvelous authors out there to read, and I think that having access to social media has really helped to spread the word about all these different books, because I've also been having another conversation with a lot of other female nonfiction writers. We are constantly pushing against what's known as, sometimes they're called dad books or uncle books. And these are the dozens of biographies that are written about Abraham Lincoln or George Washington. And I could also mention Alexis Coe, who has this new biography about George Washington.
Here, I will put a link to
right.
her interview right here.
Yeah, so she does the same thing. It's pushing back against this notion that we've only got this one historical narrative, and it's dominated both in subject matter and the people who write about it by white men. And yes, I'm a white woman writing about this, but I hope that I've been incorporating more Black authors into my own research. And I guess I should also point out that this is an area where Mary Walker herself really fell short. And I, I felt a profound disappointment in a woman I otherwise thought had so much going for her. But she did fall into that group of suffragists after the Civil War who demonstrated they were more than willing to see especially Black women be put aside for voting rights so that white women could vote first. And I could never understand how she came to that conclusion, given everything she had worked for through her whole life. And the only thing that, and it doesn't even really redeem her, but the only thing maybe to her credit is that she stopped doing it very quickly. Um, she abandons it, at least publicly, within a matter of weeks, which is a lot quicker than many other white suffragists did, but still it doesn't excuse what she did. I can only explain what she did and identify it as being racist behavior. And it's just not a good thing for her. And it's hard then to talk about her as a great champion of all equality, where yes, she believed in abolition, but her track record on racial equality is not that good.
One other thing that I really want to talk to you about, because is it right that you run a group about narrative nonfiction writers? Is that right?
I co-administer because my colleague and friend and partner, Pamela Toller, who also writes nonfiction, we were actually part of a larger group of 4 who started this group on Facebook called NonFiction Fans. And we tend to focus on narrative nonfiction written by women, but we do open it up to other kinds of nonfiction. We have a lot of members who are very enthusiastic memoir readers, for example. So we do try to be as inclusive as possible, but our emphasis has been on women writers, especially because, as Pamela and I know, it is a kind of a different world for female nonfiction writers.
Okay, I sort of asked that because you also said in your bio you read a lot of historical fiction.
I do.
You're a fan. But you're so into the craft of narrative nonfiction that I wanted to ask you. I have a lot of students who ask me, I'm trying to decide whether I'm writing historical fiction or narrative nonfiction. I have my answers for that. What is your answer for that? If somebody says, should I be writing nonfiction, narrative nonfiction, or historical fiction, where should I fall? What is your advice on that front, since you're so steeped in one and a fan of the other?
I think for me, it does come down to how you use your sources. And if someone is wanting to add things into the narrative for color or texture, then I would say you probably want to write fiction, and that's fine. And as much as I do love historical fiction, and I'm not so wedded to historical detail that once I see that it's shelved with fiction, if something is different in there than in the historical record, I don't fault the author. I don't say, oh, this person obviously doesn't know anything. I understand that in service to the plot, you may have to do things. And so as long as it's labeled fiction, then I'm fine with that. In my own writing, I have always taken the approach to be very clear when I'm speculating about something. And that means that I haven't been able to find a source for it. I may think perhaps this is what Mary Walker thought or how she felt about something. And that's how I will phrase it in the book. I realize it's more cumbersome and some people might find it a little clunky, but as a historian, I can't present something as fact if I can't back it up. And for me, this even goes to things like the weather. I mean, I won't even write, Mary Walker went out on a rainy Sunday afternoon to check on the battlefield conditions. If I don't have some kind of a document that tells me it was a rainy Sunday afternoon, it doesn't get put into the book. So for me, that's where the line is. And then I guess there's a further blurring of the line because there is this thing called creative nonfiction, where some writers who do describe themselves as being nonfiction writers will take license with some of those descriptive things. So it is kind of a blurring of the genres. So there's a lot of things to choose from out there if you're thinking about writing about something or if you want to read about something.
What's the benefit of this creative nonfiction land? You're making up some details, but you're still nonfiction. But if you're making it up, why aren't you just calling yourself a fiction writer?
Well, that's the big question. And does this all go back to Truman Capote? I mean, isn't he the one? He wrote his nonfiction novel in cold blood. And, you know, a lot of literary people have looked at that and said, well, what is true and what isn't? If you're taking notes, when you talk to people, do you have your quotes direct? I mean, reporters know about these things, other writers know about these things. So you're right. Where is the line and what is the purpose of adding that kind of detail if you don't really know that it happened for certain? I think it comes back to things like texture and atmosphere and how you draw readers in. But for me, drawing the reader in comes with the true story. I mean, for nonfiction. For fiction, it's different. But for nonfiction, it's because they want to know, did this really happen? And how did it really happen?
Yeah, I always feel like it's my job to get somebody interested in Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael, so they will go and read the nonfiction version or go visit them in a museum. So they will go seek out the real information. But it's my job to get you like story and emotionally hooked in, so you really want to go track down the real history. It's fascinating.
Right. And for me, and that's exactly right, because for me, the very best historical fiction that I read sends me right to something in nonfiction. You know, I want to know more. What did this really happen? And it's not then that I'm disappointed that it didn't, but I just want to know. So it is a way, I think, of furthering knowledge. And a lot of people who have joined the NonFiction Fans group on Facebook are also big fans of historical fiction. So sometimes, you know, somebody will say, hey, have you read this? And, you know, there'll be a little discussion about something that is in fact fiction, but we're very clear on what that difference is.
See, like a good piece of historical fiction. Now I'm fascinated by Mary Walker and I have to go read everything about her. Because really, her life sounds fascinating. And
yeah, and one more plug. I'm always so conscious of the people who I have built my own work on. About 10 years ago, a scholar named Sharon Harris published what I think is the other best biography of Mary Walker, and it's called American Radical. And Sharon really gets into even more detail of Mary Walker's life, some things that I kind of skimmed over about her childhood and her family background, and especially if you're interested in Mary Walker as a writer. And Mary Walker did not only short sort of magazine pieces, she wrote a couple of books. So if you're interested in that kind of literary background, there is another really good book out there about Mary Walker, but mine's the newest.
Story time with Stephanie Storey. Story time virtually. We've got time and plenty of stories, talking stories in a novel way. Story time with Stephanie Storey.